So you could,
Laura,
go ahead.
if you'll give us your name and your affiliation, just so we have it on the tape, and then go.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Laura Ladd Bierman, and I'm the Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of New York State. The League is a nonpartisan political organization working to promote civic responsibility through informed and active participation of citizens in government. We are best known for the work our 4,000 members and 48 local leagues throughout the state do in registering and educating voters on local and state issues. However, advocacy has always been an important facet of League activity since our founding as an outgrowth of the women's suffrage movement 100 years ago this year. On behalf of the League, I want to thank the Commission for this opportunity to speak about campaign finance reform and a small donor matching system for New York State. For many years, New Yorkers have been frustrated by the deplorable condition of our state's campaign finance system and the outsized power of wealthy interests in Albany. These problems have persisted, but not because of lack of awareness or an absence of solutions. Two special commissions, one in the 1980s and one 5 years ago, of which our own Barbara Bartoletti was a member, looked at a campaign finance system beset by corruption scandals and called for sweeping and comprehensive reform. Still, our state leaders failed to act. Our colleagues at NYPIRG just released a report on the 2018 New York State legislative elections, confirming that concerns about the campaign financing system found by these earlier commissions still persist, in that successful candidates receive the bulk of their campaign funds from organized special interests and the wealthy, rather than small donors. These same special interests make their presence known in Albany through a pervasive pay-to-play culture that continues to reveal itself in scandal after scandal. Comprehensive campaign finance reform, including a small donor matching system, is the change New Yorkers so desperately need. For decades, the League, along with our good government colleagues, have tirelessly worked toward this end. This commission now has before it a historic opportunity to make sweeping improvements to our broken campaign finance system, a system which has far too long undermined democracy and encouraged public distrust in government. Cynicism and public distrust in government discourage public participation in our democracy, as well demonstrated by New York's weak voter turnout year after year. At the national level, the League has long been a leader in reforming our nation's campaign finance system to ensure the public's right to know, combat corruption and undue influence, and enable candidates to compete more equitably in public office and allow maximum citizen participation in the political process. The State League has supported public financing in New York State elections for many years, and the New York City League was an early and strong proponent of the public financing for New York City elections. Among the well-documented benefits of public financing are a greater diversity of candidates elected to office and an increase in the number of overall contributors, especially the number of small donors. We already know the benefits of a small donor matching system, and we also know how to establish such a system through the example of the New York City system. The work of previous commissions, Governor Cuomo's bill in the 2019-2020 executive budget, and the extensive research done by our colleagues in the Brennan Centers and others focused on implementing public financing. However, the League strongly believes that effective, independent, and adequately funded enforcement and much lower limits on all campaign contributions, including contributions to parties, are also fundamental to reforming New York's broken campaign finance laws. They should not be viewed as mere additions to implementing a public financing system. New York cannot build a functional public financing system on top of the existing weak enforcement structure and sky-high contribution limits. Robust, independent, adequately funded enforcement, greater campaign finance restrictions for all candidates and parties, and public financing must go hand in hand. Substantial and sweeping changes are needed to the entire campaign financing system. Specifically, the League urges the following critical reforms. We need to reduce contribution limits for all candidates, not just those participating in a public matching system. New York currently has by far the highest contribution limits of the 39 states that limit contributions, of which $69,700 for statewide office is the most egregious example. This has the result of focusing candidates on larger contributors and organized interests. Contribution limits for all candidates, not just those participating in public financing, should be lowered to levels more consistent with federal limits, including contributions to party committees and party transfers to candidates. It is critical that the Commission lower contribution limits across the board for all candidates in order to avoid discouraging candidates from participating in the public matching system. We need to establish an independent campaign enforcement agency outside the Board of Elections to enforce campaign finance laws for all candidates. Experience to date with the Enforcement Division within the State Board of Elections has not always been positive. New York City has a separate campaign finance board that has jurisdiction over all candidates. Similarly, we strongly believe that the same board that administers the public matching system should enforce campaign finance laws for all candidates. It should have a guaranteed stream of funding to ensure that oversight is strong and the public's money is protected. We need to further reduce or eliminate entirely contributions by all lobbyists and contractors doing business or seeking to do business with the state. The legislative session in Albany is notoriously replete with continual fundraising from lobbyists and special interests, and this particular reform is long overdue. There are many examples from other states of effective pay-to-play restrictions, as well as New York City's extensive system. We need to place reasonable limits on party housekeeping accounts at all levels. Currently, there are no limits. Like the recently closed LLC loophole, housekeeping money has long been a major source of avoidance of New York State's already weak contribution limits. There should be new reporting requirements instituting complete disclosure for bundlers of contributions, similar to those in New York City. The new Campaign Finance Board is also an opportunity to reform campaign finance databases and better inform the public. Establishment of a small donor public matching system without these other reforms will diminish the likelihood that candidates will participate in the new system. It will allow the status quo in which organized interests and large contributions have an undue influence in Albany to continue. We ask the Commission to institute a long overdue complete reform of New York's campaign finance laws. On a more informal note, I would just like to say, voters want their vote to count, and they want to be heard. Our democracy is strongest with full participation. The League has worked hard for decades to make voting easier and more accessible, to increase voter participation. Last year, we applauded the many election reforms that were passed, but we still have more work to do there. We will also monitor closely and participate in the new redistricting process, which will be implemented following the 2020 census. Along with election reforms and equitable redistricting, though, a robust public financing system is needed to help voters believe their vote matters. Voters only hear in the media about the large connected donations that their elected officials receive. Why should they worry about who is elected if the official will be beholden to large donors? Why should they vote? A small donor matching system, along with the other important campaign finance reforms, will encourage more people to consider running for office, but also will tell the voters that their elected officials will listen to the constituents, not just the large donors. Voters will vote if they think their vote matters and the elected official is listening to them. The current voter participation rate in New York State is dismal. We must change that. People need a reason to vote. Public financing can help make that change. On behalf of the League, I want to thank the Commission for inviting us, and I wish you all well in this important task before you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Laura, first of all, thank you for all you do and all the League does in this area. Of question. Is our expenditure limits, spending caps, an essential part of a matching fund public finance program?
I can't answer that directly. What I can say is that we do agree with the models that of the New York City, and we also agree with what Alex Camarda has said on from reInvent, the Brennan Center. We are developing more details on exactly what we would want to be included in some of these, and we look forward to seeing what you all come up with, but I can't say off the top of my head right now the answer to that question.
If you get more details, please pass them on to us.
We will. Thank you very much.
You mentioned some of the reasons for why the system is needed. I'm just curious, voter turnout in a city that has the model of campaign finance system, have we seen that result in higher turnout numbers?
Yes, I believe so. Again, the League isn't a think tank organization. We don't maintain the data on that, but our colleagues have done research on that, and we can look toward, NYPIRG and reInvent and the Brennan Center to see the results of those.
I believe historically, turnout in the cities is abysmally low.
Yes.
Yes.
Statewide, that is, too.
Statewide as well, I agree. In terms of incumbency, are you experiencing a high level of incumbent defeats?
No. I can also tell you that, no, we do know that the incumbency rate in New York State, I don't separate New York City from the rest of the state, we cover the whole state, is still high.
Your testimony cited those to be consequences of a public finance system as to why it's necessary. I know that at the state level, where there wasn't public financing, there was a great number of incumbents that were defeated this year on both sides of the aisle. I'm not aware of those things occurring in New York City where a public finance system exists.
If we had public financing, we do believe that there would be more candidates running for office. We think there would be different candidates running for office. It would be a more diverse pool. We think it would interest more people in running for office, which thereby would interest more people in voting. Because there would be more people running, and also they might relate more to some of the people running for office.
I understand the rationale. I'm wondering whether or not that has materialized here in New York City.
I don't have the data to answer that.
In terms of, you had mentioned corruption as well. Is New York City free of corruption in their public financing system?
Again, I can't answer that. I don't study New York City completely. I'm more at the state level and just watching what we see in the
So
media.
at the state level, are you seeing a lot of corruption in terms of not the governmental side, but the electoral side? What campaign finance scandals are you seeing at the state level?
We're talking about the pay-to-play culture is what I'm talking about, and lobbyists and contracting and bidding and those scandals is what I was referring to when I was talking about corruption scandals.
Okay.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I'm just not aware of what I understand the anecdotal kind of messaging on it, but I'm not sure of what you're pointing at. So I just didn't know if you had a specific.
Well, all the recent scandals and the recent.
You're saying contributions lead to corruption, is what you're saying.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that there's more of a potential to allow that if we aren't enforcing the rules that would not allow lobbyists or other large donors to be influencing decisions made by our government officials.
I've asked others, do you have a position with respect to union contributions?
Sorry, say it?
I've asked others, do you have a position with respect to union contributions?
No, we do not have a position specific to that.
Would you consider union contributions to be special interests?
I would have to look into that.
Okay. I think it's important that when we're talking about this, when we're talking about special interests, it's all special interests. It's not particular interests that we're trying to exclude
Right.
from the process.
Right.
And as you know, the federal government prohibits contributions from corporate contributions,
Right.
LLCs, and unions. They treat them the same. We do not here. We've made a positive step forward with respect to LLCs, but we still have corporate money, we still have LLC money, and I just haven't heard much discuss what we're doing on the union side. And no one seems to have even thought about that, which is surprising to me.
I'll look into it and get back to you.
Okay.
Thank you then.
Thank
you
you.
very much. Okay, Susan Lerner. There you go. Great. Again, you'd
Thank
say
you.
name.
I'm Susan Lerner. I'm the Executive Director of Common Cause New York. And I would like to approach the task before the Commission somewhat differently than I think prior testimony has. First of all, I want to thank you. I think you have a very difficult and unusual job. Without resources and staff, it is particularly difficult. And what I'm about to talk about, unfortunately, makes, I believe, your task more difficult, because I believe the starting point for developing a workable and effective public financing system shouldn't be with contributions, it should be with expenditures. The real key, we believe at Common Cause, to designing an effective public financing system is in where you set the maximum matchable amount. And that's based on our experience in setting up the Connecticut system, and it's also based on recent changes and discussions that have happened in the New York City system. All too frequently, for political reasons, there's a lot of discussion, there's been a lot of research into the campaign contributions, the way at which it can impact or warp our decision-making process. But your charge is to come up with a workable, practical campaign finance system. And to us, that the key, as I said, is how much of the money that is going to be spent in campaigning is actually provided by the public. Does it allow a candidate to effectively communicate their message to the voters? And how much of the expected expenditure is actually going to be public? How much of it is going to be matchable? And when you start with that orientation, a lot of the decisions really fall, I think, more easily and in a different framework. The key is data, and unfortunately, as far as I can tell, there really hasn't been a clear and detailed discussion and analysis of how much does it actually cost to campaign for various offices here in New York State. There's been some discussion of should there be different contribution limits for different parts of the state, should there be geographic determinations, but the key to that is, does it really cost more to run an effective campaign in different parts of the state? We have not done that analysis, in all honesty, and I'm not sure that anybody else has that I've been able to find. But certainly for legislative races, I suspect that if the data were analyzed, we're not going to find a great deal of difference. The difference is in media markets, and certainly for legislative races, what you're talking about are the costs of mail. Mailing is going to be pretty much the same. The cost of printing, that's pretty much going to be the same. The cost of putting people out to canvass, it's going to vary somewhat, but not radically. We don't have that data. And I would suggest to you that this sort of inquiry really needs a robust and open legislative process to develop the answers to these questions. I want to compliment the Commission for holding these hearings. I think it's extremely important that you're hearing from experts and the public, and I would like to suggest to you that when you have a working version of what you think would be an appropriate statute, that you commence another discussion with the public. Open hearings are the preferred way, because what we've seen time and again is that there are so many details in a public financing system and no perfect way to do it. Every single jurisdiction does it differently, and the big question is, what are the public policies that you're seeking to advance? And what is the campaign context for our state? We know what the contribution context is. That has been very thoroughly researched, but we don't really have an understanding of what the expenditure side is. And so, unfortunately, without staff, I think you might consider asking some of the entities that have the analysis capability to help you figure out what's a reasonable amount to maximize the impact of public financing of elections. Are you looking to provide the ability to run a capable campaign with completely matchable funds, which is the current approach in New York City? Are you looking to provide enough public funding to cover what has historically been the average amount for 60%, 70% of campaigns historically? I would suggest that this is an important determination to make, because it really goes to the essence of what we're trying to do, which is not to have a policy discussion, but to set up a practical system. Can candidates actually use it? And are we furthering the goals of allowing candidates to use public money and be successful in communicating with the public?
Are you suggesting that that also include expenditure limits and spending caps?
You know, that's a very controversial issue right now because of the state of federal law. The current thinking, apparently, among campaign finance experts across the country is that we stay away from expenditure limits because of the difficulties of Supreme Court decisions. I think from a practical point of view, if it were doable, I would say yes. It is important to have expenditure limits. I think that that helps address some of the public's concerns about our campaign finance system, which seems to be awash in large amounts of money. And I think it helps, again, be sure that our system is practical and is set up to actually be usable and not just a policy statement.
So you're suggesting that we need to look at how much it costs to run a race in order to determine what the match should be?
That's what the maximum amount is.
Maximum match.
That's correct.
Right.
And then the whole question of what the max match should be is really, I think, a determination of how quickly do we want to get the public money to the candidates. Because if you look at the history of the New York City system, we've all spent a lot of time talking about the 6-to-1, the 8-to-1 match, but the truth of the matter is that the actual amount of public money that's provided to the candidate has actually not varied tremendously. The speed and the difficulty of getting to that maximum changes based on your matching amount, but if your max of public funding stays the same, whether it's a 6-to-1 match or an 8-to-1 match, is simply how quickly you get the money and how difficult it is to actually get to that max.
Would you get the money for both the primary and the general?
Absolutely. We at Common Cause believe that there should be public financing for both the primary and the general. And in response to an earlier question about how the New York City system has worked in terms of really engendering competition, there are two factors in New York City which I think have a really significant impact on our New York City elections. The first is our public financing system, but the second is the fact that we have term limits. 2 term limits. And as a consequence, what we see are extremely crowded primary elections, particularly for open seats. We're not going to have that interaction at the state level, at least initially. And so I think there are different factors at play. We see incredibly competitive races in New York City.
Let me just, 2 points. One, in New York City, for the most part, in many, many districts, you get elected at the primary.
That's correct.
So that is a distinction. Now, when we talk about these expenditure limits, how would those work with the existence of independent expenditure groups, other groups that are involving themselves in campaigns? How do you reconcile that? What do we do?
So in that, again, I think the trick is in setting the limits appropriately based on the actual campaign context. it's our belief that a public financing system is actually the only effective counter that we currently have to independent expenditures. What we see time and again with independent expenditures coming in, if there is a really large amount of independent expenditures announced or disclosed, what happens is the private donors often freeze up. The larger donors don't want to invest in a losing candidate, and the independent expenditure scares the larger contributions and makes it much more difficult for a candidate facing that sort of stress to respond. What we see is exactly the opposite in a public financing system. Often, small dollar contributors who are constituents and voters in a district get offended that there is outside spending coming in, and they want to support their candidates, and it actually is possible to have an effective response with public financing. If the public financing maximum is properly set, a candidate has the ability to respond effectively to whatever is being thrown at them and not to worry that the private funding is suddenly going to dry up in the larger amount. So we believe that it's actually the only effective current response to independent expenditures.
How will you implement to have a properly set expenditure?
I think it's through an analysis of what historically has been spent and try and come up with an amount that would cover some reasonable percentage of what historically has been spent. It's never going to be possible for public financing to cover all of the maximum races. But analysis that in other jurisdictions has shown that the amount that's expended tends to cluster, often related to the actual practical expenses, and so that you can, with analysis, have a sense that you can say with some justification, the maximum of public funding or the maximum match and private money that's matched that we're providing is going to cover the vast majority, or 60% of what historically has been spent for this race. And that means that we're providing enough public money which allows an effective candidate that has a reasonable base of support in their district to communicate effectively with the voter. Does that mean that they will be facing consultants who aren't going to be able to fill everything in their wish lists? Yes, that's going to be true, but it's also going to have the impact, we believe, of holding down the cost of campaigning. Again, the key is what is our actual campaign context, and how are we looking to facilitate allowing candidates who have a real base of support to effectively communicate with their voters without wasting public money, without creating large war chests that just roll over. Because the goal of a public financing system, it seems to us, is to arm candidates who have a base of support with what they need to effectively communicate with voters. It's not going to help weak candidates, and it shouldn't qualify candidates who don't have a base of support, which also, when you have a sense of how much it costs to actually run an effective campaign, can help you deal with the question of how do you qualify. We have examples in recent times here in New York State and in New Jersey that if you set your qualifying standards too high, you hobble your system and people can't use it. Again, what's going to be practical? What are our goals in setting up a system? Hopefully it is to engender appropriate reasons for well-based, community-based candidates to be able to run, and ideally to try and control the outsized impact of large amounts of money in our public financing system, which is a lot harder to do. So I believe if you start from an expenditure analysis, that you help to craft a system which addresses those public policy concerns. The second area, and this is one where I think we're more consonant with a lot of the people who've testified today, is the whole question of administering a system. We've been involved in Common Cause not only in setting up but sustaining and improving campaign finance systems across the country. I personally was involved in trying to, and ultimately was successful, revive the Los Angeles city system, which had not been improved or evolved in several decades and therefore had fallen into disuse. A lot of that has to do with both the faith that the public and the candidates have in the effective administration of the system. And here I am going to chime in the general call for an independent enforcement and administration agency, one that is nonpartisan, one that is professional, and one that has the charge of both being responsive to candidates, educating them, providing them with reliable guidance, but also protecting the public fisc. It's a very dynamic tension that we see in having an agency that has independence, but also is creative enough not to create a system which is so onerous that you have to have teams of accountants protecting you from the administration of a public financing system. So there is a balance. For instance, and there's probably a sweet spot in terms of the size of that agency, and it's somewhere between 4 people in Maine and 60 people in New York City, where you have enough people to accurately assess the qualifications, be sure that the candidates who are applying for public money actually have earned the public money and get the public money out to them quickly. Because public money that comes very late in the process is a disincentive to actually participate in the system. So as you can see, we've been really focusing on how to make it work, and a little bit less on some of the larger political questions, which I think have been covered by the other excellent people who've been testifying this morning or this afternoon.
Thanks, Susan. Quick question as it relates to what you've seen work in other states or municipalities as it relates to creating an independent board. Are there any specific appointees that you'd recommend, size, et cetera, that you want us to keep into consideration?
So talking with some of my colleagues who've been involved in setting up and improving the independent agency, I think for New York State, we think that the size is probably somewhere between 15 and 25 people. And we think that that is dependent on providing encouragement to the agency to be creative in its auditing and enforcement. 25 people is not going to be able to turn over every single receipt for every single campaign across the state, but that means that you need some sort of sampling procedure. It means you need the authority and the courage to do spot audits, and that you need to be creative in how you protect the public money, but also do it in a way that is reliable and does not unfairly burden, particularly community-based candidates who often are running for the first time and may not have access to highly skilled advice.
So if I just may add, the city campaign finance board, I think, has 60 people,
Yes, that's my understanding.
and the statewide program would be 4 times the number of offices?
Right, but again,
And then you would cut the staff in half?
that's
of the
correct.
60?
Based on our experience in Connecticut, where you have a similar number of offices, the Connecticut Clean Elections
That's
Agency
just a whole
has done a
different
good job.
program than the matching program, though, the clean elections. It's
Well,
not
but
a-
it also has matching components, and it has significant qualifying requirements and the need to move money out only to people who are actually qualified for it.
And what would you do with the audits on the 213 plus 4 every cycle?
So-
Just randomly check them?
In Arizona, which had a...
No, but I'm talking about New York.
Yeah, I would use the Arizona model, which for full public financing prior to that system being decimated by the Supreme Court, had a very effective spot auditing and random audit system with sampling. And sampling is something we've been urging the New York City system to use more extensively. Because at this point, I think there is very good thinking statistically in terms of how you set up an effective sample.
So how do you think that the public, the everyday worker on the street, one, they would find out that $100 million of public money is going towards political campaigns, and that we aren't even checking every race to make sure they're spending it responsibly.
So first of all, I think the qualifications have to be checked on every single race. So the idea that we're not checking every single race is not one
But
that I
even
would
then, you only have
accept.
25 people for 217 plus challengers.
So I think, one of the things that we're seeing at the city level in terms of the qualifications and the reporting is the technology has really provided a much better way in which to handle this than having, I don't want to, exaggerate, but having individuals turning over every $5 taxi cab receipt. We really are in a different situation where you can set up algorithms and testing. If you set up, which we would have the ability to do in a state system that we're building from the bottom up, robust computerized reporting that you then can
So
test
if you
for
don't check a
anomalies.
$5 taxi receipt, where do you draw the line?
So again, I think what you have to do is set up a system that checks for anomalies and checks for patterns which are way out of the ordinary, because that's basically how people cheat.
But that would
Is
take
it-
a while, right? I mean, arguably, if it's a new system, you would need some historical data to identify anomalies.
And I think we have that historical data. I just don't think it's been analyzed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can I just ask one question?
Great.
Can I ask one question?
Yes.
The complexity of which you speak to this enforcement streamlined process, do you think that can be accomplished in the short time that we have, considering all the other components of this program? And it seems to me that in creating a new agency, the way that you've described, you need to spend a lot of time figuring out how you can effectively guard the public dollar with 25 people. And if
So-
that's not in place, it jeopardizes the rest of it. So do you think that that's something that this commission can really take on in
I
that
think-
short period of time?
I think that the commission can set up a framework for study and development within the commission's charge, which is fairly specific, and I would say urge the commission to stay very closely to its charge. You already have an unusual situation in being set up and being charged this way. Stick to the things that you've been asked to look at, and one of the things that you've been asked to look at is the time it would take for the system to actually be in place. So you have some flexibility in that regard in terms of setting a timetable that you think provides the necessary time and analysis to set it up right.
So you're talking about when the program would actually incept, when it would
That's
begin
correct.
to provide public financing.
So
Doesn't
this-
doesn't have to happen January 1, 2020.
That's
So this
correct.
commission would set up a commission.
I'm sorry?
essentially. This commission would set up a commission?
No, I think that in the agency, you would authorize a
within the
working group
agency.
within the
Okay.
agency that could then work with consultants and computer experts to set up a system in a 2 or 3 year time period that would be workable while you build your public financing plan, similar to the way in which we are looking at a online voter registration system. It's not going to happen instantaneously. It has to be built correctly. And that takes time and some study and analysis.
If it takes that much time, study and analysis, why not just return it to the legislature, who can go through this in the normal course of business with public comment, input, and advice? Why do it here?
Because
if
the
what we're doing
legislature
here?
has delegated it to us.
No, but I'm asking specifically to the
Specifically.
point of a new entity
Yeah.
that whether or not we can really tackle that problem of a 25-person enforcement and oversight body, whether or not that can be accomplished within our time frame, and if it cannot, why not just return it to the legislature if what I'm hearing correctly is it would take a good amount of time after our recommendation to figure it out?
Well, I think there are two levels. Number one, Common Cause has not endorsed the formation of this commission. In all honesty, if you've seen my public comments, I believe this should be a legislative process. But you are now faced with the question, and certainly we are interested in a public discussion in any forum as to what should properly go into an effective public financing system. So in response, yes, I think this is a legislative determination, but it also can be a determination by an agency, as I said, to set up a working group and to hire consultants. New York City is the only place in the country that has as large a public financing staff as it does. We have effective public financing systems in other states that do it with fewer than 60 people.
Susan,
you.
I'm sorry, Jay. Regarding staffing, Denora had asked earlier, and I think you might have misunderstood, she wasn't talking about staffing, she was just asking for suggestions on the board. I'd like to add on to that, while you mentioned some suggestions for the board, who or what body would be the appointing factor, being the only person who's a representative from upstate, and how would we make sure that we would have board representation from all across the state and certainly not just downstate?
Mm-hmm. So this is a question we tackle all the time at Common Cause when we're looking at commissions of different sorts. And unfortunately, there's no perfect solution. A lot of it has to do with culture and expectation. One of the reasons why the New York City Board, I believe, is successful and well respected is not because of how it's appointed, but because it has always functioned with an expectation that it would be independent, as I think Fritz Schwartz, very ably explained, and that is something that we've seen in setting up bodies in other states. It's why Common Cause, quite frankly, advocates for nonpartisan bodies rather than bipartisan or political bodies, because the charge when you set up a partisan combination, whether it's bipartisan or a tripartite, major parties and unaffiliated representation, is that the primary responsibility is to the category in which you're appointed, as opposed to the idea that it is possible, and we see this across the country outside of the East Coast, to have a nonpartisan administration. So a lot of it has to do with the charge that is given to the people that are chosen.
Okay, thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Appreciate your testimony. Dan Cantor, Working Family Party.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm sorry.
Hello.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today.
Yeah.
I'm Alex Rabb. I'm here with Dan Cantor and Heather McGee. And we request that if you have any questions for us, you please reserve them until all three of us have spoken. As an election lawyer for the last 10 years, I've served as general counsel to the Working Families Party, and I've represented multiple candidates for public office, including several whose campaigns fell under the jurisdiction of the New York City Campaign Finance Board and its comprehensive system of public campaign finance. The Court of Appeals has repeatedly and unequivocally held that the New York State Constitution guarantees voters, candidates, and political parties the right to participate in a system of fusion voting that the legislature, and by extension this commission, may not abridge or diminish. The court's words leave no doubt, and the history of their decisions is instructive. In 1910, in the matter of Callahan, the Court of Appeals struck down a new law that prohibited some types of party committees from nominating any candidate who was already the nominee of another party. In the court's decision, Chief Justice Cullen and Justice Gray affirmed that the state cannot enact arbitrary exclusions from candidacy for office. And they asked, what exclusion could be more arbitrary than that one party should not be permitted to nominate the candidate of another? The court went so far as to liken a fusion ban to a law prohibiting the nomination of red-haired candidates. Ultimately, the court found the legislature had no power to forbid such fusions and combinations as the electors choose to make. The next year, Tammany Hall was reeling from New York City municipal elections in which a fusion ticket ousted the machine from control of the city council. In response, the Tammany-controlled delegation to the state legislature took steps to curtail the effectiveness of minor parties and fusion tickets at the ballot box. Unable simply to ban fusion, the legislature enacted a statute that prohibited the names of candidates from appearing twice on the ballot. Instead, only the candidate's line appearing first on the ballot would list the candidate's name. Any subsequent party line that would otherwise include the candidate's name would instead simply say, see column A or column B, referring the voter to the line of the presumably major party on which the candidate's name appeared. The Court of Appeals considered this statute in 1911's Hopper versus Britt, and again affirmed that the legislature not only couldn't ban fusion, but also couldn't indirectly affect the same thing by rendering it more difficult to vote for a coalition nominee.
But wasn't the key to that, Alex, that at that time you could vote a slate vote by checking the box at the top of the column, and what the court said was if you wanted to vote for the candidates on the fusion line, you then had to go and check other boxes, and it was almost an unequal protection argument more than just an outright you can't do it?
Right, but the court did say you can't, again, you can't affect the same thing by rendering it more difficult, not much more difficult, not this method, but you can't render it more difficult to vote for a coalition nominee. Now, writing again for the court, Chief Justice Cullen noted that the otherwise plenary power of the legislature over elections cannot be used to disenfranchise voters, and any system of election that unnecessarily prevents voters from voting for the candidate of their choice violates the Constitution. Now, the court has since revisited and reaffirmed the Constitution's absolute protection of fusion voting. In the 1973 case Devane versus Toohey, the Court of Appeals considered a statute that prohibited candidates for all but judicial or statewide office from receiving the nomination of both a party and an independent body. Striking down that law, the court again cited Callahan's statement, which it described as prophetic, that no exclusion from candidacy could be more arbitrary than a ban on fusion voting, and reaffirmed that no law may, and I quote, prevent a qualified elector from exercising the constitutional right to vote for a candidate and party of the elector's choice.
But don't we have that system now where if an independent body nominates somebody and they already have two lines, you combine lines on the ballot?
And that specific issue hasn't been litigated by the Court of Appeals, but every time the Court of Appeals has considered a law burdening fusion, they've said the same thing, that you can't do it. Now, Commissioners, the Court of Appeals has made it clear time and again that fusion voting enjoys the absolute protection of the New York State Constitution. This commission simply may not recommend that the state ban or otherwise burden our longstanding system of fusion voting. For your convenience, I brought a written version of my testimony today, and I've attached the cases that I've cited. And thank you again for allowing me to appear. I'm going to turn it over to Dan.
Okay. Dan Cantor, co-chair of the Working Families Party National Committee, formerly director of the New York State WFP. Very much appreciate this opportunity. Alex has described the constitutional protection that fusion enjoys, affirmed and reaffirmed. It also functions well. I'll mention a few reasons why it's useful for our democracy. First, it makes for a more informative ballot, and it highlights important issues to our elected leaders and candidates. Voters do not always know where candidates stand, especially in down-ballot races. New York State's system, as you well know, candidate typically has one major party line and one or more minor party lines, and the minor party endorsement can serve as a signal to the voters as to that person standing on important issues. For example, the WFP campaigned for years for a raise in the state's minimum wage. Make your vote really count, we would say over and over again. Vote on the WFP line, send a message. On Election Day, if you favored a raise in the minimum wage, there was no better way to express that than to cast your vote on the WFP line. You knew that doing so carried a message about the importance of higher wages. Fusion voting informs voters, but it also allows them to inform candidates and elected officials of their views. Second, it provides a home, a political home, and a voice for minor party voters. It is simply not true that all voters fit neatly into either the Democrat or Republican box. They want more choices. In fact, surveys show that about 50% of the people in America, in the entire country, have voted for a third-party candidate at least once. That is a lot of voters. But in the states without fusion voting, those third-party votes are wasted effectively. They don't help elect candidates, and they don't influence policy. Disenfranchising anyone is a serious offense against democracy, and undermining minor party voters in New York, hundreds of thousands of them, is a kind of disenfranchisement. We should be very careful before harming anyone's political home, any other person's political home. Third, famously, fusion solves the spoiler problem. In states that don't permit fusion voting, a minor party voter is in a terrible bind. You can cast your vote, you can waste your vote on a candidate who has no chance of winning, or if you do really well, maybe you can spoil. You can drain enough votes from the candidate you don't like to help elect the candidate you really don't like. Two words that make this clear: Ralph Nader. Fusion solves the wasted vote problem, and it solves the spoiler problem. It allows everyone to vote for the candidate they favor, who has a real chance of winning, and to vote for the party that they prefer. As you all know, nearly every single election in New York State is a fusion election. It's rare for a candidate to run with only one party label. They run on two or more lines because the candidates want to appeal to the voters who support those minor parties. History suggests that voters understand and like fusion voting in New York. In 2012, 6.5 million votes were cast for the two major party candidates for U.S. Senate. Of that total, 650,000 votes, 10%, were cast for the two major party candidates on the minor party fusion lines. In some local and county races, that number can sometimes reach 20 and 30%. In other words, a lot of voters understand and use this system. The question is, why do they vote? Why do voters cast that fusion vote on a minor party line? As you'll no doubt hear in the public hearing later today, it's because they like what that minor party stands for, whether it's WFP on the left or the Conservative Party on the right. They don't want to waste their vote, and they don't want to spoil. What they want to do, and what they have been able to do, is the right to vote for both a candidate and a party. The Commission needs to ask itself, do these voters, who are citizens with rights no less than other voters, do these minor party voters deserve less respect than voters who prefer the major parties? To ask the question is to answer it. Should only major parties be allowed to show their support for their favorite party? Of course not. Now, in reality, the major parties dislike fusion. They kind of wish it would go away. But they put up with it because it's the law. It's not some privilege that important people have bestowed upon the voters. It's a constitutionally protected right. So I'll sum up. Fusion works. It has a long history. Voters rely on it. It encourages turnout, especially among younger voters. If our elected officials want to take the outrageous step of tampering with a constitutional right, they can do so, and I'm confident the Court of Appeals will reject them for a fourth time. But the legacy of this body, of this commission, important commission, should be to work out the details of a desperately needed campaign finance system that strengthens our democracy, and not instead to leave a legacy of undermining the long protected constitutional right of fusion voting. Thank you, and with that, I turn the floor to Ms. McGee.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for granting us all the right to speak here today. My name is Heather McGee. I'm the immediate past president and currently a distinguished senior fellow at DEMOS, which is a New York-based national nonpartisan research and advocacy organization working to create an America where we all have an equal say in our democracy and an equal chance in our economy. In a volunteer capacity, I serve on the boards of a number of social justice organizations and philanthropies, including the National Committee of the Working Families Party. As an attorney and advocate for a more robust democracy nationwide, I want to associate myself with the testimony in support of strong public financing in New York, but spend my time explaining the crucial pro-democracy function that minor parties and fusion voting plays, and why this committee should protect it. Fusion is a protected constitutional right in New York State. As my colleagues have testified, it has been affirmed and reaffirmed by the state's highest court. But it's also essential to a just America. Let's start at the beginning. Why do we even have political parties to begin with? Why are they considered essential elements of a healthy democracy? In a democracy, parties are essential for the orderly functioning of government, for the peaceful transfer of power, for coalescing like-minded voters into blocs that can pursue their beliefs. In a mass society like ours, no single individual can possibly follow every single candidate and every single issue, so parties are powerful ways to signal to voters precisely who stands for what, and then to organize once in government. Political parties were born in America. The Democratic Party is, in fact, the oldest political party in the world, and the Republican Party, formed in the crucible of the struggle against slavery, is only a few decades younger. Now, we know that these two parties have dominated American politics since the Civil War. Because of the structure of the American electoral system, there's an inherent bias in favor of two parties. I refer here to the winner-take-all, first-past-the-post election system. We don't use any sort of proportional representation in America. Countries that do almost always have a multi-party system that does a better job of representing a wide range of public opinion. What we have instead is fusion, which is the American version of proportional representation. Indeed, political scientists sometimes call it modified proportional representation. It allows a political minority, understood arithmetically, not demographically, to play a useful and durable role in politics. And what we may not know is that for the first 125 years or so of the country's history, and especially during abolition and picking up tremendous steam after the Civil War, fusion parties and their voters were an absolutely vital element of American electoral practice. Now, the reason why voters form and join third parties is always the same. It's because they can't find an adequate home in one of the major parties. Today in New York State, as Dan mentioned, hundreds of thousands of voters choose to make their electoral home in a fusion-eligible minor party. For those voters, fusion makes democracy work. And with all due respect to the commissioners in your charge here, to remove that democratic home via an unelected commission would not only be unconstitutional, as Alex Rabb has testified, it would undermine democracy and justice in New York. And that's because fusion is actually one of the little-known actors in the history of social progress in America. One of the early anti-slavery parties, the Radical Abolition Party, fused with anti-slavery Whigs in New York and elsewhere. The better-known Free Soil Party acted similarly. After the Civil War, it was the turn of the populists, who split off from both the Democrats and Republicans because they wanted an organization to truly battle the railroads, banks, and monopolists. It's fair to say that most of the social progress that we have made as a nation, and of course there is still a long way to go, gets made because of outsiders who put issues on the political agenda that the dominant parties have not. Indeed, the issues championed by minor parties have had a major impact on the nation: abolition, Social Security, child labor laws, unemployment compensation, women's suffrage, the 8-hour day, anti-lynching laws, antitrust laws, and so much more. These groups organized and worked, and eventually the major parties adopted these ideas, and that's a good thing. Here in New York, the Working Families Party itself can proudly claim to have helped move once fringe issues like paid sick days, the repeal of the Rockefeller drug laws, the Climate and Community Protection Act, and many more to the center of our politics where they belong. But to every action, there is a reaction, and in the early part of the last century, fusion voting was eventually undone in most states by the two major parties. Today, only 10 states still allow fusion in one form or another, and we should be proud that New York is one of the states that does so, and that our highest court has rebuffed all attempts by powerful interests to tamper with the rights of voters in this regard. Indeed, I would say that now more than ever, fusion voting is needed. We are embarked on a great moment in U.S. history right now. It's a contest to determine who all is truly included in we the people. And it will be the rules that determine the answer. The rules of who votes, who counts, whose voice is heard. That's why we need a healthy, inclusive political environment if we're going to take on these challenges, and that must include an electoral regime that allows citizens to form minor parties that operate under fusion rules. It's no accident that minor parties like the WFP can often be more attentive to the recruitment of candidates who are not well-to-do white men. The WFP spends a lot of time and effort recruiting working-class people, women and people of color, to run for office. That is part of the mission in charge. I'll sum up briefly. The idea that this commission would in any way undermine or tamper with long-established rights enjoyed by the people of the state is a terrible idea. Getting public financing is right is important. Leaving fusion alone is equally important. If you do both, the voters of this state will owe you a genuine debt of gratitude. Thank you.
I have a question. Thank you. I appreciated your advocacy for fusion voting, but my question is, what's your reaction, if any, to any elements of public campaign financing that we've been discussing? And that other experts have addressed. In general, for instance, expenditure limits, matching contributions.
So it has been the position of the party for a long time that public campaign financing is long overdue. That the inequality of voice among people because of how much money they can gather together is a great injustice, and it makes our democracy all the poorer. I would just say that because we've spent so much time talking about public campaign financing, and fusion is on the agenda for the commission, and I think we're the only ones here to talk about it. We'd really like to spend our time that way.
Can I just weigh in on this just for a second, if I could? Because you made a number of statements, and I just want to see what your reaction is to a couple that I would have in response. Number one, you said that eliminating fusion voting would limit voter choice. Eliminating fusion voting would limit voter choice. But right now, fusion voting, some would argue, I would argue, does limit voter choice. In Nassau County, running on the Democratic line for district attorney is an incumbent named Madeline Singas. She has the Conservative Party line, and she has the Working Family Party line. How does that not confuse the voters as to what that candidate stands for? You say that it makes for clarity. The fact is, a political party is supposed to, in its foremost obligation, represent to the voters what it stands for by presenting candidates for office. By supporting the candidate of a different party, it does complicate what the voters might be understanding and does limit them. And to answer your question about wasted vote, because it's different, wouldn't ranked voting in the state of New York take care of that problem, in that the Working Family Party could put up a candidate different than the Democratic Party, et cetera, and voters would be able to deal with that particular issue? I would also say that, the concept of coalescing like-minded voters, which, has been spoken about, and powerful ways to signal to voters who stands for what, would be most beneficially clarified, if you will, by running candidates on your own line. My concern with fusion voting as it relates to this commission's obligation is what would be the consequence of all of the various primaries that might take place with minor parties, where in the state of New York, in areas like suburban counties, upstate counties, the major parties look to and need to help them win the minor party lines. And so I would see a proliferation of primaries, opportunities to ballot and the like, to gain those lines, which would have a cost impact, I believe, on the entire campaign finance program. That's where I think the complication comes in. That's why I think part of the reason is that this commission has to look at it.
See if I understand that last point. You're saying the existence of fusion somehow makes the campaign finance system more expensive and...
That's right.
Okay, so that's an incoherent comment, with all due respect. Fusion reduces the number of candidates. It doesn't increase the number of candidates. When you give money to a candidate, when you're in the public financing system, the money doesn't go to the party. It goes to the candidate. The candidate gets a set amount of money, no matter how many parties wish to endorse that person. Remember, fusion is voluntary. You can't force someone to accept your line. You have to want them, they have to want you. So fusion reduces the cost. In 2009, the WFP nominated 45 out of the 51 Democrats who ran for city council. All 45 participated in the public financing system. All 45 got the grants from the Campaign Finance Board. They don't get more grants because they're on our line. And if we ran 45 of our own people, which is what we would have to do in your non-fusion system, Henry will tell you, yes, all of those working families people would essentially double the cost of the campaign finance system. So I think,
I think you're missing the whole point.
You just said, I asked you to clarify.
I think you're not looking at the entire point. Here's what happens in the suburbs. The city is of no great consequence.
You don't have public financing in the suburbs yet. We're saying, you're asking me about
But
a public financing system.
You're asking us to establish it for the suburbs and the state as a
Okay.
whole. So, Dan, if I might, I would tell you that in the city, you don't need a minor party to win. In most of the places, if you get the Democratic line, you're going to win in the city of New York. I will tell you that, because that's just the way it goes. In the suburbs, however, and upstate New York, you do at times need the minor party lines as they exist. That's where you're going to have the primaries or opportunities to ballot, because you will have candidates that will look to get those lines, and if you do not have a Democratic or Republican primary, you can then spend money, campaign money, public money, to promote a campaign to win over those lines. It's not done as much now because people don't have the resources, don't have the money to do it. You allow public monies, it's going to open the whole question of then promoting more of these primaries. That's a concern.
Commissioner, whether or not you have fusion, as long as you have parties, you have a candidate selection process for the parties. So the logic of your question has to do with whether, without fusion, there will be fewer people competing for different parties' lines. I'm not sure I see the logic, unless the purpose of eliminating fusion would be to drive some parties out of business. I think that would be a suspect motive, but either way, I think it's beside the point, because as I described, the Constitution just forbids banning fusion. It's not one of the options before this commission.
That's your reading of the court. There'll be a court case, I'm sure, if it were to come about.
I mean, it's my reading of case law that says unequivocally, you can't do that.
May I go on a
Excuse me,
slightly-
can I interrupt for a second? With all due respect to my fellow commissioners, there's litigation over this issue now. I don't think this should be debated legally here. There's a policy aspect of this that this commission has to decide whether we're going to undertake to address this issue at all in our deliberations. But there's a lawsuit pending, and I'm not sure there should be a debate on the legal issues at this point.
Can I then ask a policy question, which is, are there other states where fusion is legal, where there is public financing, and are there, in the implementation of that, how does that play out?
Yes. Connecticut is the one other state that has fusion voting and has public financing of elections. And I strongly encourage you to bring the director of the campaign finance system in Connecticut here, who will tell you it is not relevant, right? They give the money to the candidate, not to the parties. And the stories and it's one big suburban state, and somehow they don't seem to have this problem that you are conjuring, because they've been running the system for many years quite successfully, and they do it quite efficiently to help our Republican appointees as well. That's because of there aren't term limits. Where there are no term limits, you have many fewer.
There are not term limits?
There are not term limits, as there are not in the New York State legislative system either.
Then, in terms of political impact, there are at least 40 states, some people say as many as 47, that don't have fusion voting, and you work in several of those states. Does the lack of fusion voting impact electoral results? Are there less competitive races as a result?
Yeah. I mean, it's a less healthy system in our experience. There's about 10 states that allow fusion in one form or another, but really only 3 right now where it's practiced routinely. And in those 3 states, you get a wider range of opinion. You might disagree that that's a useful goal, but some of us think that's a good goal. So we think it's a very healthy thing. And we would regret New York's commission from moving against this long-standing practice, because we think you should your charge is to strengthen democracy.
Yeah, but based on your work in other states, does fusion voting create a more competitive situation in your experience? You may not know.
It produces more competition. Well, it depends where. It's very different. It can produce competition between the Democrats and a party to its left, as in our case. That's a kind of competition as well that many political scientists think is quite healthy.
Which are the other two states? You said three.
There's New York, Connecticut, and Oregon
Oregon.
have ongoing systems. There's another 6 or 7. It actually happens occasionally in New Hampshire and in Vermont and in South Carolina. It's legal in Mississippi, but nobody knows it, so we're trying to tell them that's legal. And it's legal in the presidential race only in California, and it's legal in Washington state now as well, in a peculiar form again. But New York is the mothership for fusion voting. Famous story is in 1934 when all of those Italian and Jewish and black workers, radical workers in the Communist Party, wanted to vote for Franklin Roosevelt, but they did not want to vote for him on a capitalist line, the Democratic Party line. So they sat down and they decided, let's form ourselves a new line. They formed something called the American Labor Party line, and they all voted for Franklin Roosevelt on the American Labor Party line because they wanted to show, as we often do, that they liked Roosevelt, not Wilkie, or whoever it was, Landon, Alf Landon. They liked Roosevelt, but they wanted to vote for him on that American Labor Party line to show that that's what they stood for. And that is a very valuable thing to hold on to in this state.
So just to jump back in on the cost aspects of it, because that's what I've been most concerned with in terms of even considering anything with respect to fusion voting. My thinking has always been in line with how you're presenting it, that the elimination of fusion voting will result in more candidates and greater strain on a limited amount of money that we have available to us. If I can understand, the question was whether or not, in thinking of it from a general election standpoint, that's where we're coming from, whether or not the primaries, I thought the point you were making was that there's the potential that in a non-fusion voting setup that you actually may result in greater primaries. Now, I don't know why that would be the case, but is there some reason to think, I just want to make sure that I'm understanding the cost side of it properly. Is there some reason to think that you'd anticipate more primary elections?
More primary elections if there's not fusion?
Yeah.
More cost to your system or just more primaries in general?
Well, I thought the point that was being made was,
Yeah.
no, fusion voting in the context of public financing may create more primary costs in the suburbs. Is that the point you were making?
That's what he was
that's
making,
true.
but that's certainly not the experience in Connecticut. I really don't think it's speculative at best. What we know is that if you can't fuse, there will be more candidates because the minor parties who typically fuse won't be able to do that. Conservatives who want to support you might not be able to do that in the future. They'd have no choice if they wanted to maintain their presence. And again, some people don't think third parties should exist, but we think they should. They have every right to. And they should be allowed to support the candidate they prefer, even if that candidate is supported by a major party. It's not necessarily the candidate's fault. What could he tell you?
If it was an exception, I don't think it would be a problem. It's the practice. And it's not that people don't support minor parties. We just believe that minor parties should be promoting their own candidates to give the choice to voters. Of the
They are our own
candidate
candidates.
that supports.
Why are they not our own candidates, Mr. Commissioner Jacobs? They're also the Democrats' candidates, or for the conservatives, they're also the Republicans, but they're ours as well. And we deliver 10 or 12 or 15% of their vote, and we go to the day after the election, we say, congratulations, by the way, we were serious about that housing issue or tax campaign that we want you to take up. They're our candidates.
And yours is not the only party that is a minor party. There is also the Independence Party and numbers of other parties that also play in this environment. And the difficulty, and what I'm trying to express to you, is that it's not necessarily an issue of the Working Family Party. And as you know, we have gotten along pretty well when you and I have done business in our county. But I will tell you this, that when you look at what has gone on with the Independence Party and some of the other parties, there will be more primaries to gain access to those lines by the major parties if the resources are available to candidates to do that. It's not that we expect the money goes to the parties. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that
So
all of
you're
a
saying
sudden,
that in
those
competitive,
lines.
I now understand your
Yeah,
view. So
that's
you're
my
saying
point.
that in competitive districts.
That's right.
So a Republican will say, oh, I have the Republican line,
Mm-hmm.
so I'm now going to go spend money on the Conservative Party primary. Well, that candidate's a fool because his actual need is to beat you in the general election, and they're going to save their money for the general election. I have yet to see a candidate spend a nickel.
Well, I just have one comment in line with what you're saying, is that it doesn't prevent a Democrat or a Republican without a minor party endorsement from creating a primary in their own line.
What I'm saying is that what I'm saying is this, you could have the circumstance, and you will have the circumstance, where Democrats and Republicans who do not have a primary on their own line will then spend campaign finance money to have primaries on the minor party lines, because there would be, I would suspect, money set aside for primaries and money set aside for general elections. It would not be the choice, to my understanding of how the system would work, that you would have just one lump sum of money. You see, that's the problem that I see.
Commissioner, I do want to refer you to your own language as well. You expressed a concern about voter choice. And then you also just said, we, presumably the commissioners, maybe you as a Democratic Party official, feel that the minor parties should choose their own candidates. That is not an expression of a preference for voter choice. You said just now that you want to limit the choice of minor party members and voters to their own candidates. That's specifically the type of unconstitutional limit the court was talking about in 1910, 1911, and 1973.
I'm saying that if the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, the Independence Party, the Working Family Party, and any other party all picked one candidate because they liked him or her, then that would be limiting voter choice. I'm saying when parties have to pick their own candidates, you are expanding voter choice. That is all I'm saying.
Parties choosing their candidates is an important and constitutionally protected aspect of voter choice.
Can I just make one other comment? Also, you don't have this just with minor parties. If you look at the judicial races on Long Island, the Democrats and the Republicans cross-endorse everybody. So what's the difference there? But specifically to the fusion voting issue, I myself have personally cast a vote on a minor party line for the exact same reasons that you're espousing up there. I'm not necessarily in love with, whoever might be there, but they do have a line on which I associate myself with the principles of that minor party. And secondarily, this is a very educated room with respect to elections. But people have to realize that there are hurdles that you have to pass to become a recognized minor party. You don't just say, hi, I'm the Kim Galvin party, here I go. And I mean, you have to reach a certain threshold, and from what I understand, most parties have surpassed it. If you look at the Libertarians, they have tried for years and years and years to hit the threshold. They've hit it. And I think it's ridiculous for the organization that they've done to then think about eliminating them when you could raise a threshold for the number of votes cast in a gubernatorial, or you could, tweak around the edges if you're the legislature and choose to do that. But I agree with the panel that the reading of the enacting legislation for us does not allow us to get into that issue, unlike some of my colleagues.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh,
Yeah, copies.
Yeah. 10 copies. 10 copies?
Thank you.
Great. We'll start now. Take one. We don't need all of them. Here you go. Thanks. Yeah, well, you know what?
Edward Murray, New York City Bar Association. How are you? Please give us your name, your affiliation, and let's get started.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Edward Murray. I'm an attorney testifying today on behalf of the New York City Bar Association's Election Law Committee and Government Ethics and State Affairs Committee.
Could you speak into the microphone a bit more?
Is it
Thank
on?
you. It just has to be closer to you, that's all.
Hello.
That's better.
there we
Thank
go.
you.
I will start again. Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Edward Murray. I'm an attorney testifying today on behalf of the New York City Bar Association's Election Law Committee and Government Ethics and State Affairs Committee. The committees strongly support this Commission's task of establishing a system of public financing of elections that curbs the influence of money in elections and helps level the playing field for candidates. I would like to testify today about who should regulate the public financing system and the procedures by which the election law should be enforced. Today, the committees released a report entitled Safeguarding New York's Elections, the Unfinished Business of the Moreland Commission to Investigate Public Corruption. A copy of that report is appended to our written testimony. As you may recall, in 2013, the Moreland Commission found that the enforcement policies and practices of the New York State Board of Elections were designed for inaction and thus recommended the creation of an independent enforcement agency. The legislature subsequently created the position of Chief Enforcement Counsel, or CEC, to exercise sole authority within the BOE to investigate election law violations. As detailed in the committee's report, the adoption of the CEC position and related forms has failed to safeguard the integrity of New York's elections. From 2015 through 2018, and with oversight of more than 16,000 state and local candidates and committees, the CEC obtained fines in 20 matters in total. Nearly all of the enforcement activity during this period was against persons who failed to file disclosure reports. Notably, the question of whether a person filed a disclosure report presents a simple factual and legal question, yet these matters could take up to 2 years to resolve, typically by settling for a small fine. To a certain extent, the lack of enforcement is a product of the limited resources available to the CEC. However, it is also the result of the statutory scheme. The statute sets out a cumbersome two-step process for imposing civil penalties: an administrative hearing to assess whether a violation has occurred, followed by a court proceeding to impose a penalty where a violation is found. The two-step process is required regardless of the severity or complexity of the violation. Incorporated into the administrative hearing is a three-factor analysis by which a hearing officer can dismiss a complaint. To dismiss a complaint, a hearing officer can consider whether the subject of the complaint made a good faith effort to correct the violation or has a history of similar violations. These factors are designed to slow or stop enforcement activity. For example, the election law has long provided that the BOE notify a non-filer no later than 10 days after a reporting deadline of its reporting obligations, and that a failure to file within 5 days of receipt of such notice is prima facie evidence of a willful failure to file. Yet under the current framework, before enforcement action against non-filers arguably becomes conceivable, the committees are not only notified on multiple occasions to file a report after the deadline, but are also afforded multiple opportunities to disregard filing obligations altogether. Finally, the civil penalties in the election law do not cover much of the conduct that the CEC is authorized to address, including filing inaccurate or untrue disclosure reports and improperly converting campaign contributions to personal use. Under this statutory scheme with its many holes...
Excuse me, did you just say the CEC is not authorized to address such things?
Oh, the CEC is, but there are no civil penalties set forth in the election law. Yes. Under this statutory scheme, with its many holes and hurdles, robust enforcement is simply not feasible. The committees encourage the Commission to undertake a broad review of the election law and consider the following reforms. First, in lieu of the two-step process for imposing civil penalties, the administrative hearing followed by a court proceeding, the administrative hearing officer, or upon the hearing officer's recommendation, the regulatory authority should be empowered to make a final determination as to the violation and proper penalty subject to CPLR Article 78 review. This framework is consistent with other administrative enforcement regimes in New York State and further recognizes the capability, competence, and experience of the regulator in crafting the proper penalty. Second, the election law should include traffic ticket-like procedures for enforcing routine violations, such as failing to file a disclosure report. Such streamlined procedures are used in other states and by the Federal Election Commission. Third, the election law must provide comprehensive civil penalties so that there are actually consequences for illegal activity. Finally, Candidate and committee violations should be publicly reported. The efficacy of monetary penalties alone to deter campaign finance violations has been questioned, as fines can simply be internalized by campaigns as the cost of doing business. Thus, public reporting of violations which occurs in other states may play an important role in bringing about compliance. The Commission may be able to adopt some of these reforms as reasonably related to the administration of a public campaign finance program, and so improve enforcement measures against not only participating state candidates, but also independent spenders, political parties, and local candidates. However, to the extent it cannot, the Commission must devise procedures for more robust enforcement than what currently exists. Yet absent a recommendation by the Commission for a new nonpartisan agency, the state legislature can simply sit idle while the Commission's recommendation for placing oversight of the public financing system in an existing agency, likely the BOE, becomes law and a two-tiered enforcement system inexplicably takes hold. Accordingly, the committees further support a recommendation by the Commission for a new nonpartisan agency, one that would ultimately regulate all aspects of campaign finance, not simply the public financing system. The creation of such an agency would not only best safeguard taxpayer dollars, but also encourage the development of a more coherent and consistent enforcement of the campaign finance rules against all regulated parties. The committees believe that election law enforcement should not necessarily be excessive or punitive. However, at a time when democratic elections are being undermined by threats near and far, from dark money to foreign influence campaigns, more robust and transparent enforcement of the state election law is necessary. These reforms and others recommended in the committee's report, we believe, can bring a greater measure of integrity and public trust to the electoral process. Thank you for your consideration of our recommendations.
Sir, could I just ask you a few questions so you could clarify for the other members of the committee here? If you know, if not, I'll do it. Who the CEC is and how that office was established?
Sure. As detailed in our report, the Moreland Commission recommended the creation of a structurally independent enforcement agency. Following the issuance of that recommendation, the state legislature set up this position of Chief Enforcement Counsel. The current position, it's a 5-year term. The current occupant of that position took over the position in September of 2014, and that term has expired.
So for the people, the current Chief Enforcement Counsel is a she, and if I'm mistaken, she is ostensibly an independent enforcement counsel, as a lot of people are calling for, independent enforcement. She was picked by the governor and confirmed by the houses of the legislature. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, in the 5 years that she has, so when you're talking about enforcement and traffic tickets and failures to file and all of those things, you're speaking about that office specifically.
Based on this report is based on the work of that office.
Right. So that has nothing to do with the bashing of the State Board of Elections that continues to happen here proper. I just want to,
The State Board used to be much more effective in dealing with non-filers.
The State Board of Elections was much more effective in dealing with non-filers and the traffic tickets. We weren't just big on the newspaper articles. So, in your responses from the board, I'm assuming that's where you got all of your information?
I received data, submitted FOIL requests from the board and data from the board. That's correct.
So you must be aware, how many failure to file hearing officer proceedings were there in 5 years? Was there 28 or something like that?
There were a total of around 25, 26 proceedings over a 4-year period. Most of those did involve, it's set out in our report. Most
26.
Of all, yeah.
Yeah, I don't have your report yet. And also for the people's edification, were you aware of how many actual official matters were brought to the board? Like, other than to the hearing officers, but to the commissioners?
In terms of?
The totality of things the Chief Enforcement Counsel asked the 4 commissioners for the State Board to rule on.
Regarding subpoenas and criminal
Yeah.
referrals. That's set out in our report as well.
But just for, I don't have your report, I didn't see your report, so I'm sorry about that.
Sure.
But, so there was 73 matters brought to the commissioners in 5 years. 19 criminal referrals went unanimously. 46 subpoena requests, 41 were granted. for all the people thinking that the State Board of Elections bipartisan gridlock has stopped enforcement, it's simply not the case. There were 5 times where the Chief Enforcement Council is allowed to break a tie. That did occur. And there were 3 other matters all related to a poll and what questions to release. 4 matters were noticed to the board as closed and 1 matter tabled. So in 5 years, the independent enforcement agency, 19 referrals and 46 subpoena requests, 41 of 46 were granted and all 19 were. So as we hear about gridlock and bipartisan fighting at the Board of Elections and infringing on someone's enforcement, the statistics just don't bear that out. And I do agree with the gentleman that there should be a penalty schedule in place. Now, nothing would have prevented the Chief Enforcement Council from proposing a regulation to do that.
To the extent that the board could have adopted regulations, I'm sure that they should do that. There may be some prohibitions.
But you certainly could have proposed one, or...
There could have been proposals for adopting further regulations to enforce the law. But again, I think a fundamental issue here is the statutory procedures that we encourage this commission to take a look at.
Fair enough.
Can you define independence? You're calling for an independent committee. Can you give us a sense of what you think that would look like?
That seems like a loaded question, but I am going to defer to the wise man who spoke earlier today that you cannot necessarily legislate independence, but I think there are ways to set up an agency that can facilitate independent action.
Can I just ask you one follow-up question now that I'm over people bashing where I work? That wasn't you. What would you say about a proposal? Let's just assume the State Board of Elections, and there's an enforcement unit within the State Board of Elections to do routine traffic ticket matters, failures to file, hearings, compliance reviews that get referred because the filer won't fix them, things like that. And then original jurisdiction to the Attorney General's Public Integrity Unit for the more serious criminal matters.
I think the committee's going to encourage effective enforcement, and it seems like that could provide such enforcement.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry? Yeah, can we do that? Can we turn, can you hear this all right? This is clear, right? Okay, that we have to just maybe move that closer. I think that's the answer. Let's see. Okay, Frederick Schaefer and Amy Loprest, New York City Campaign Finance Board. And let's try to speak into this so that everybody can hear. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Rick Schaefer, and I'm chair of the New York City Campaign Finance Board. With me is Amy Loprest, executive director of the CFB. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. In 1988, after a series of corruption scandals, New York City voters approved a ballot proposal that created the CFB and New York City's landmark public matching funds program. By holding candidates accountable to their constituents and amplifying voters' voices, the Matching Funds Program ensures that voters, not money, have the final say in New York City government. For more than 30 years, the Matching Funds Program has sought to reduce candidates' reliance on big money and the resulting public perception of corruption in local government by making small campaign donations more valuable, thereby redirecting candidates' attention from special interests to everyday voters. We've seen how the Matching Funds Program brings more individuals into the political process. Candidates who participate in the program tend to engage contributors from every neighborhood in all 5 boroughs. In the 2017 elections, 93% of census block groups in New York City had at least one contributor. As a result, large contributions from special interest organizations and wealthy donors play a smaller role in city campaigns than in those for state or federal office. In those same elections, 96% of all funds raised by candidates came from individuals, most of it from city residents. Further, 76% of contributions in 2017 were for $175 or less. While the Commission has many options to choose from in creating a public matching funds program for the state, any program is only successful if the candidates participate. Our matching funds program has worked well for both first-time candidates and incumbents and continues to boast high participation rates. Typically, 90% of candidates participate in the program throughout the primary election, and roughly 2/3 of candidates participate in the general election. When creating a matching fund system, there will inevitably be many decisions to make about how to run such a program. Here are some factors to consider regarding how our matching funds program operates. Matching rates and contribution limits. When it was first established in 1988, the Matching Funds Program matched contributions up to $1,000 at a 1-to-1 ratio. To increase the incentives for candidates to raise small dollar contributions, the rate was changed in 1998 to provide for a 4-to-1 match for the first $250 in contributions. And it was again increased in 2007 to a 6-to-1 formula for the first $175. Last November, New Yorkers overwhelmingly approved a ballot measure to increase the matching rate yet again to 8-to-1 for the first $250 for citywide offices and $175 for all other offices, and to increase the amount of public funds available to candidates. These were codified by the City Council this year. We are already seeing changes in fundraising under the 8-to-1 matching rate. Smaller contributions are becoming even more frequent. In the 2019 election for public advocate, the most frequent contribution was $10, compared to $100 in previous elections. Additionally, the charter referendum cut contribution limits by more than half, lowering contributions for mayoral candidates from $5,100 to $2,000, and lowering contributions to city council candidates from $2,850 to $1,000. Based on our analysis of the 2017 election, the combination of an increased matching rate with lower contribution limits ensures that candidates have the resources to run robust campaigns while minimizing the risk of corruption often associated with large contributions. Doing business. Further, contributions from individuals who are doing or seeking business relationships with the city are bound by stricter contribution limits. The doing business limits are crucial to the program as they aim to reduce the reality or appearance of pay-to-play contributions. The doing business contribution limits are $400 for mayor, public advocate, and controller, $320 for borough president, and $250 for city council candidates. Thresholds. In order to receive matching funds, candidates must satisfy a two-part threshold. Thresholds must be set high enough to ensure that only serious candidates are able to receive public matching funds, but must be low enough so that they do not present a barrier to people running for office and qualifying. For example, city council candidates must raise $5,000 in matchable contributions and collect 75 contributions from the district they seek to represent. Candidates for mayor must raise $250,000 in matchable contributions from at least 1,000 city contributors. Disclosure and enforcement. Like voting, our enforcement and disclosure procedures are ways for New Yorkers to hold their elected representatives accountable. The CFB publishes detailed public information about funds raised and spent in city elections by candidates and independent spenders, thereby bringing greater transparency to the democratic process. Our rigorous audit and enforcement procedures ensure that candidates are all held to the same standards and that legislators are held accountable to their constituents. While rigorous audit and enforcement procedures are crucial to the Matching Funds program, it is equally important that candidates be able to navigate the Matching Funds program as easily as possible. To that end, our dedicated candidate guidance and policy staff works diligently to help candidates navigate the program as efficiently as possible. Nonpartisan and independent structure. A key component to ensuring the strength and integrity of the program is our board's independent, nonpartisan structure. The board consists of 5 members. The mayor and the Speaker of the Council each appoint 2 members who may not be enrolled in the same political party, and the chair is chosen by the mayor in consultation with the Speaker. The board also has a protected budget. The board's independence and nonpartisan structure and status ensure that administration of the Public Matching Funds program is not directly influenced by political pressures or agendas of the moment. I might add, for example, our current board is 5 members. There are 3 Democrats, 1 Republican, and 1 member of the Working Families Party, and there is absolutely no division on party lines. I've never seen it in a single vote. Program challenges. As you consider how to design a new system for the state, it may be useful to discuss some of the challenges we faced in administering the matching funds program. As noted, contribution limits must strike a proper balance. They must be high enough to ensure candidates can run a viable campaign, but also not so high that they present a corruption risk. The contribution limit in our system has decreased over time. Prior to the enactment of the matching funds program in 1988, candidates for mayor and other citywide offices could accept contributions up to $50,000 for primary elections, and the same amount for the general election. For the first cycle under the matching funds program, the limit was reduced to $3,000 for each election for a total of $6,000. Some subsequent reforms consolidated the 2 limits into one and reduced the overall limit further. We've heard from some candidates that the program should be responsive to income and wealth disparities across neighborhoods. The requirements and costs of a campaign in Manhattan, for example, are certainly different from a campaign from Eastern Brooklyn. We're different from upstate, and perhaps we have less variation, but we certainly have a lot of variation in New York City, too. However, currently, the matching rate and public funds cap are the same for candidates running for the same office throughout New York City. This is not to say that the Commission should not consider addressing regional differences, but rather to demonstrate that a uniform approach has worked for our system and can work. One of the potential issues of setting different matching fund rates or public funds caps for candidates in different areas is the added complexity for both candidates and administrators.
Sorry, the added complexity of
for both candidates and administrators. The Commission may still wish to explore this issue, but the CFB has no established framework for doing so and no data that would be useful to you. Thresholds play an important role in ensuring that only serious candidates who have demonstrated a significant level of public support receive a public funds payment. Thresholds serve as a clear basic set of criteria to determine which candidates are running viable campaigns. Additionally, to conserve public funds, the program provides safeguards against paying candidates who face only nominal opposition. To be eligible for matching funds up to the maximum amount, candidates must show that they are opposed by a candidate who meets criteria demonstrating that he or she is a serious opponent. For example, an opponent who has received 25% of the vote in a recent election or has received significant endorsements from other elected officials or membership organizations is deemed a serious opponent. If the candidate is unable to point to an opponent who meets any of those criteria, their public funds payment is capped at 25% of the maximum amount. To further limit the wasteful expenditures of matching funds, our system has rules that limit payments to candidates in small primaries. When less than 1,000 voters are eligible to vote in any election, payments to the candidates are capped at $5,000. In general elections, appearances on multiple party lines do not entitle candidates to additional public funds. Additionally, the Commission should prioritize striking the right balance when setting the maximum amount of public funds. Of course, you've already got a limit in your enabling statute. In New York City, the maximum amount has risen over time, and now essentially the campaigns can be fully funded by public funds if the candidate is able to raise enough private contributions. In recent years, independent expenditures have come to play an increasing role in our elections. However, the Matching Funds program has provided the resources for candidates to overcome significant independent spending campaigns opposing them. In 2013, 3 candidates were able to overcome being outspent by independent expenditures at a 2-to-1 margin and still win their elections. Additionally, all 4 of the council candidates who were supported by the largest amount of independent spenders on their behalf lost their races. While there's no perfect system to counteract independent spenders, the Matching Funds program continues to allow candidates to run competitive campaigns. Furthermore, our system has perhaps the most comprehensive set of disclosure requirements for independent expenditures anywhere in the country. Independent spenders must file disclosure statements with the CFB once they have spent more than $1,000 on a single candidate or ballot initiative. Organizations making large contributions to independent spending groups must also detail the largest sources of their own funds so that dark money has no place to hide. Communications made through independent expenditures must include detailed paid-for notices listing the spender's principal owner, CEO, and top 3 donors, as well as the URL for the CFB's website, where voters can find additional information on the independent group's funding. Finally, the city charter requires the CFB to assess the Matching Funds program after each election cycle, highlighted in our post-election report. This presents an opportunity to demonstrate how the Matching Funds program worked in a given election and for the board to suggest legislative changes to enhance its impact. Over the decades, this regular review has provided the basis for City Council action and charter revision proposals that have pushed the Matching Funds program to evolve and to continue to meet the needs of candidates in a changing political landscape. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. We are happy to provide more detailed information about our program upon request and are also happy to answer any questions you may have.
Great, thank you.
Can you describe how your budget is protected for the commission?
Yes, well, you do it, so why don't you answer that?
In the charter, there's a provision that the board proposes their budget, and the mayor has to include it in his executive budget without amendment at all. And of course, then the city council votes on the budget, but the mayor has to include the budget without change in his executive budget.
But the council has the authority to amend your budget. But
They do, yes.
Have they ever done that?
No. I mean, they, once or twice, after discussion, some minor givebacks, mostly in the public fund, the amount for the public fund for a particular year, especially in off year, years that there's only going to be a special election.
One of the members earlier asked a question. I'm sorry, Henry, did I cut you off?
Yeah, in terms of the administrative budget, there's never been any change?
No.
Thank you. Sorry. One of the members earlier asked a question I thought was very good. Is there anything in the current plan that you have now that you would recommend changing or would prefer to change?
We haven't rehearsed this, so I'll give you my answer and let Amy give you hers. I thought in our last report to the City Council after the 2017 budget cycle that our most important recommendation was to increase the match for the citywide offices, mayor in particular. The Charter Revision Commission then decided to increase the match from 6-to-1 to 8-to-1 for everybody across the board. But when you looked at the data, the position that still garnered the largest amount of large contributions compared to all the rest was that of the mayor. And so the new change to 8-to-1 with the lower limits may solve that problem, but we'll have to look at the data for the next election because the percentage of large contributions to the mayor was disproportionate to certainly to the city council and really to every other race in New York City. So to me, that's the one that needs to continue to be looked at to see whether we're being as effective in the mayoral race as we are in the other races in diminishing the impact of large contributions. Amy, you may have a different answer.
No, I mean, I think that, most of the recommendations that the board made in its last post-election report were enacted either by the Charter Revision Commission or the City Council. So we make recommendations after each, and we've worked very collaboratively with the City Council in enacting different changes to law. And I think the one that Rick has pointed out is really the most important one that was made, is because while mayoral candidates in the 2017 election collected large numbers of low-dollar contributions, still the majority of their money came from high-dollar contributors.
Do you have an enforcement? I'm sorry that I don't know this. I should know this, the amount of time I spend reviewing your systems. But do you have a criminal referral in-house process, or is that just your local DAs?
Well, it's both.
Is it?
I mean, we do audits after every election cycle. We audit everyone. And when we uncover violations that we think are willful and criminal, we refer them to local district attorneys.
And that's through your 5 commissioners, or is that just at a staff level, or the referrals?
Yeah, I'm not sure I know the answer to that.
I mean, obviously, they're not publicly voted. It's discussed with the board, but they're referrals because the decision on whether or not to take a criminal action is ultimately decided by the prosecuting authority, either the DAs or the U.S. attorneys. So the referral is made with the information from the staff and the board, but it's the determination of whether to pursue a prosecution obviously is made outside of our agency.
Right.
Of course, we do civil enforcement within
Right.
the agency.
Yeah, I'm fully aware. I get your reports and all that. I was just wondering about the criminal aspect.
Yeah, no, I mean, the board is notified, and we talk about it. We don't have public hearings on it. As it turns out, 4 of the 5 members of the board are lawyers, and 3 of those are former prosecutors.
No, I agree. I was just curious because that's something that we didn't understand.
Sticking with the enforcement side of it, do you think that a complete audit of every candidate is necessary?
Well, necessary. So it's in some ways ideal. I mean, we have the resources to do it, and of course, we only have elections every 4 years. We have a unilateral body, and so we're able to do it, and I think it's been helpful in preserving public confidence in our system. If you talk to people who have used the system in the past, candidates and elected officials, some of them think we're too tough in this regard, but obviously it is the public's money, and if you want to keep this system operating, you need to every day earn the confidence of the public. On the other hand, we certainly recognize at a state level, resources are limited. You have elections every 2 years at the legislative level, and it's a big state. And so obviously some choices have to be made. I think a random audit or periodic audit process can work. I did note the conversation earlier today, I've been here all day, about audit criteria and procedures, and
Keep going. You can finish.
keep going? Thank you. And obviously they have to be worked out, but this is not rocket science, and it need not be invented ab initio. There are audit standards and procedures that exist for governmental agencies. Ours is a little bit unique, but not so unique. You have government agencies that engage in hundreds of millions of dollars of contracts. They can't audit every single contract either. So you develop internally with your staff and with outside consultants, you develop protocol. And there are ways, I think, of doing this effectively without having to do every single one.
Right, and our staff at the State Board of Elections is, they deal with your audit staff a lot because we've had some kinks in our software where they don't transfer exactly. So hopefully that bill will be signed where when they file with you, it's deemed filed with us, because I think that would. But we're very familiar with the work that you do, and it's appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Rachel Bloom from Citizens Union.
Good afternoon, distinguished members of the New York State Public Campaign Finance.
Rachel, one more. Can you bring the copies of the testimony over so we can look at it? Thank you. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Good afternoon. My name is Rachel Bloom, and I'm the Director of Public Policy and Programs at Citizens Union. We thank you for holding this hearing today and for giving Citizens Union the opportunity to publicly share our recommendations with you. I know you've had a long day and that you're going to have an even longer night, so I will skip over some of what I might have said since you have it in front of you and just try and highlight some of the things that I think haven't, some general concepts, and some things that perhaps we're interested in talking about in a little bit more detail. Citizens Union has long been concerned about the undue influence of money in politics and the possible corruption that unchecked campaign contributions can have on candidates and government officials. The perception that elected officials in New York State are beholden to special interest groups and the campaign contributions they make undermines the public's confidence in the expected impartiality and integrity of the decisions being made by state government officials. Moreover, the amount of money raised and spent on campaigns increases disconcertingly with each election cycle. Money, or the lack thereof, too often becomes the determinative factor in the viability of candidates running for New York State elections. New York State's campaign finance laws are in dire need of reform. Public financing of elections addresses both the excesses of big money and the importance of leveling the playing field for viable candidates. We recommend that the following principles are incorporated into any campaign finance program you propose. First being, of course, enact a public matching funds campaign finance program. This is something that we have long supported. We have long supported a matching model, believing that providing public funds to candidates running for public office is in the public interest and therefore a legitimate governmental interest. We recommend that the state provide public funds only to candidates who meet a significant qualifying threshold of small contributions and agree to certain reporting and expenditure requirements throughout the course of the campaign. A publicly funded matching system, such as the 6-to-1 match proposed by Governor Cuomo, will reduce the influence of special interests in elections and lessen the value of large contributions, while simultaneously increasing the value of smaller gifts. Equally as important, public matching programs expand the range and diversity of candidates who are financially able to run for office, and they make elections more competitive. Therefore, although a qualifying threshold should be set so as to include candidates with a significant base of support, it should be low enough to encourage competition and new voices. New Yorkers will feel empowered to make small gifts because of the added value of a public match. A matching system also allows donors to give throughout the course of the campaign and help contribute positively to the progressive building of support for the candidate. Since many voters do not become fully engaged in campaigns until they are well underway, a public matching system allows these political expressions to be harnessed. We recommend next that you institute limits on campaign contributions. New York State's exorbitant contribution limits encourage politicians and parties to seek large donations for their contributors. For campaign finance to truly succeed, reasonable contribution limits must be created that will allow New Yorkers to show their political support. We recommend that you significantly lower campaign contributions for candidates, both those who participate in the public financing system and those who do not. All party and designated committees, political action committees, and party housekeeping accounts. New York City's contribution limits provide a useful basis for the state program. Require that corporations and their subsidiaries be treated as a single entity.
Can I ask a quick question? Why party housekeeping accounts?
We think that party housekeeping activities should be limited to sort of actual housekeeping, like the construction and maintenance of party headquarters or offices, and not to be funneled to candidates' campaigns. Because
housekeeping is not supposed to be going to campaigns. No, it's clearly
should be and can be or would be, or sometimes different things. As
that's
long
a matter
as
of
they're
enforcement,
actually
no? Yeah.
yes, but as long as they're actually being sort of used in the housekeeping way that they are intended.
But then you would not mind not having any restrictions.
No, I would have to check specifically on that, but it's important to us that the housekeeping activities are actually, they're being used as directed and not.
They're important to everybody.
That covered some of what I was going to say about that. One of the areas we really wanted to focus our comments on today is doing business with the state restrictions. The current system of campaign finance in the state of New York does not include any restrictions on individuals or entities that do business with the state. Citizens Union supports the enactment of new rules aimed at reducing the reality and appearance of pay-to-play, whereby large contributors to candidates either gain or suffer from the perception of special access and influence over the political process. The lack of regulations has allowed for numerous instances of conflict of interest and enabled some of the most notorious corruption scandals in recent decades. It has unfortunately touched elected officials of all branches of government and from all parties, including most recently the Speaker of the Assembly and the Senate Majority Leader. As the Commission considers a public campaign finance reform, it should not leave the potential for pay-to-play culture intact. Doing so will maintain the public's low trust in the government in Albany, even with a public finance system, and will make it harder to achieve the Commission's goal of incentivizing candidates to solicit small contributions or encouraging qualified candidates to run for office. Experience from New York City, where a public matching program has been around since 1998, shows that it alone is not enough to prevent corruption. Indeed, almost 2 decades after that system was enacted, a series of corruption cases brought policymakers to the realization that doing business accountability is essential. Governor Cuomo also realized that need, and his proposal is a starting point for that necessary reform. It bans individuals or entities that are in the process of bidding for a contract with a state governmental entity from contributing to the office holder in charge of the bidding agency or to a candidate for that office. The restriction applies from the moment a vendor submits an offer until the final contract is awarded. And if the vendor won the contract, the winner is restricted from contributing for 1 more year. The proposed penalty for violating that law is $10,000 or 200% of the contribution, and candidates will be forced to return the unlawful money. Now, the governor's proposal is an important step in tackling the influence of donations on procurement decisions, but its scope is limited for a short period of time and the small number of elected officials who hold power over bidding processes. More importantly, it still allows those engaged in existing long-term business contracts with the state to contribute freely, and it does not limit the contributions of the principals of those entities doing business with the state. We believe that restrictions should be based on more expansive criteria, which will prevent possible conflicts of interest in the campaign finance system. As you consider this topic, we suggest consideration of the criteria and regulations set forth in the New York City Local Law 34 of 2007, the pay-to-play campaign finance reform. This model is based on setting very low contribution limits for those doing business with the city and making those non-matchable, as well as maintaining a doing business database to track entities and individuals involved in contracts, concessions, franchises, grants, and other economic agreements with the city, including registered lobbyists. More than a decade after it was enacted, the Doing Business Accountability Reform has been successful. Although New York City manages contracts, franchises, and other economic agreements with tens of thousands of entities, according to the New York City Comptroller in 2018, the city handled over 13,000 procurement actions for a total value of almost $30 billion. The New York City Campaign Finance Board and the Mayor's Office of Contract Services have been able to implement procedures that have made the database a well-established fact of life for both city agencies and for candidates. It currently includes over 8,500 entities and more than 37,000 individuals. We strongly support the establishment of a similar database of entities and individuals doing business with the state, which will be the basis for contribution restrictions. Moreover, such databases should be public, accessible, and machine processable. Keeping track of those doing business with government and limiting their contributions will not only help to lower the potential for pay-to-play, but will also allow the public, the press, and watchdogs to monitor possible conflicts of interest and demand accountability from their elected officials when needed. Our next topic is increased disclosure. Transparency must be an essential principle of any statewide campaign finance program. We recommend requiring greater disclosure and reporting of all campaign contributors and expenditures above a de minimis amount to include all relevant information. We also recommend that you require at least 2 periodic campaign finance reports are filed during the legislative session to reflect contributions given during the budget adoption and review process. Our next recommendation is that you establish independent oversight and enforcement, which I know you've heard a lot about today. So I'm just very quickly, our enforcement of campaign finance laws is notoriously lax, leading to many well-known instances of corruption and abuses of the system. For any system of campaign finance to truly succeed, a new independent oversight and enforcement body similar to the Campaign Finance Board in New York City must be created. This board should be empowered with the responsibility for all state campaign finance law, administration, and oversight, including public financing, and should be allowed a sufficient budget to carry out its responsibilities, as is done for the New York City Campaign Finance Board. Finally, we urge this commission to focus on campaign finance and not on fusion voting. We are concerned by reports that you are considering addressing the question of fusion voting. We believe this goal is outside the scope of the work of the commission. The law states the commission shall determine the rules and definitions governing candidates' eligibility for public financing, political party qualifications, multiple party candidate nominations and/or designations, and civil violations of public financing rules. Clearly, the commission must ensure that multiple party nominations and/or designations will not result in multiple matching funds. The reasonably simple solution is found in the New York City Public Finance Law, which provides that a participating candidate seeking or obtaining nomination for election by more than one party shall be deemed one candidate and shall not receive any additional funds. Citizens Union believes that this is the limit of the Commission's authority, and it is not empowered to abolish fusion voting because that change in the election law is not reasonably related to the administration of a public finance campaign system. After many years of legislative failure, this is a historic opportunity to profoundly change for the better how elections work in New York State. Debating fusion voting will be a serious distraction for the complex task of designing a comprehensive, effective, and successful public campaign finance system. We urge the Commission to focus on that important and consequential reform at hand. We thank you for your time.
Thank you. Anybody?
I actually have just a distinction. I know that Jay asked you a question and it made you skip a couple of things. My colleague on the other side of the table has constantly asked people prior to you whether or not they supported limits on contributions from unions, and you actually do.
Yes, we do, yes.
Okay.
Great. Great. So, thank you. Thank you very much. Zephyr Teachout. How are you?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for your patience, and thank you for holding this hearing on such an incredibly important topic. I really will be brief because so much of what I would be happy to contribute has already been on the record, as I understand it. I will separately submit written testimony. What you're doing is incredibly important. I share the view of others who testified that this is appropriately in the legislative sphere. And I think all New Yorkers will continue to hold the legislature accountable for its response to the decision that you make. But you stand in a really crucial moment. Really, the spotlight of people around the country is increasingly going to be on you, and the decisions you make about the future of how campaigns are funded in New York will have a profound impact on all New Yorkers, and potentially an impact on the direction of how campaigns are funded in this country. I want to focus on one feature that is absolutely critical for whatever you propose to be considered a legitimate campaign finance proposal. You are charged with incentivizing candidates to solicit small contributions, with reducing the pressure on candidates to spend inordinate amounts of time raising money, and to encourage qualified candidates to run for office. To do so, a public financing system must apply to primary elections as well as general elections. Failure to do so would create a system that is itself illegitimate. And it would not only be insufficient, it would not be a partway step towards a full solution, it would actually undermine those goals. Many of the campaigns in New York State, as you well know, are in districts that are heavily dominated by one party. many dominated by the Democratic Party. And so the place in which voters have their greatest voice and greatest access and greatest ability to make connections, bring new ideas or stop dangerous ideas is in the primary process. If we do not move from the big money system to the public financing system in the primary process, that will not only allow corruption to continue to fester in the primaries, but will actually encourage more money and big money to flow there. As you know, the way campaigns are funded is not a static system, it's a dynamic system. So if you install a system that allows for public financing of elections in general elections, but not in primaries, you won't just see the status quo slightly change, you'll actually see a massive flow of money, big money, towards those primaries. The demands of high dollar fundraising, which require candidates to become sycophants to the wealthiest people, not just in the state, but in the country, would become the first demands, and as they already are, in a primary system. So since one of your charges is to incentivize good people to run for office, failure to apply a public financing system to the primary stage would not incentivize more people to run for office, because the great candidates that right now feel totally shut out because they don't have friends who have $9,000, $5,000, or even $1,000 capacity would continue to feel shut out. It would not reduce the incentive to spend inordinate time fundraising, because in fact, instead it would encourage the early stages, the sort of baby stages of candidacy, to be in a state of begging from the wealthiest people and encouraging a kind of pay-to-play politics that we already have in New York. I can say more about this, but I just would say that it will be not only the view of the reform community, but of the state and of the country, if this commission does not act to apply public financing to both general and primary elections. It would actually really be a big black eye on this commission, on the state of New York. So I strongly encourage that. In April, the Brennan Center suggested that you signal early on what direction you were going, so the rest of us can be more helpful in helping work out all the details that you've been asking questions about. And I would strongly support the Brennan Center if you lay out a draft plan in the next month or so, leaving open questions. I think that will help those of us throughout the state who really want to be aides to building the strongest program. One of the things that I would strongly signal in that early draft is that any proposal will apply to both general and primary elections.
I'm sorry, can you just clarify when you're talking about a primary and general?
Yes.
Are you just talking about to make sure that there's public funds available for a primary? Because there's the other proposal where you apply it on an election cycle and it's not specific to an actual primary or a general. You just get one pot of money and you decide how it's spent. Can you clarify, are you talking about the proposal that was offered up by, I think, Revent Albany?
I'll have to look at that particular proposal,
Okay.
and I will get back to you very shortly.
Okay.
So I was talking more about the general principle. Okay, yes. So thank you for that. I would also just say that I support the essential nature of a 6-to-1 match. You've seen the evidence from other places that they move towards a 6-to-1 match to make it worthwhile. And I strongly agree with those who testified earlier that turning this commission, which was designed as a commission to deal with the way that we fund campaigns, into a commission to stop fusion voting in New York would be a serious mistake, a misunderstanding of the charge of the commission. I strongly agree also with the importance of an independent body. And I think with that, I was glad to see the website up.
So are we.
And I wanted to testify here, even though there was given a short amount of time, but I also want to make myself available as you narrow down the choices that you are going to make. We are nationally really facing a genuine crisis of democracy and corruption, and the choices that New York makes can either be ones that are profoundly disappointing or really point the entire country in a positive direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. I think we have now a break till 4 o'clock. We're going to be having the open session at 4 o'clock. They're going to be rearranging the table, I think, right? We're going to have just a mic. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, everybody.
Brief break.
Okay.